Thanks, Senator Hassan. I want to talk for a minute about restrictions on entry into the workforce. Dr. Rugy, we'll start with you. Occupational licensing, as you've acknowledged, continues to be a significant impediment for a lot of people getting into the workforce. And it also tends, I think, to be something of a barrier to interstate mobility, which in turn keeps a lot of people out of the workforce, or at least in career paths that are perhaps less fulfilling or less remunerative than they would be otherwise. Now, a lot of states, this is an interesting topic for us to discuss here because we have almost no authority over occupational licensing here, just as we have almost no authority over residential zoning and things like that. We do have some authority at the margins. I've tried to highlight the problem and underscore the need for reform in this area by exercising what authority we have. We've got plenary lawmaking authority under the so-called Enclave Clause, Clause 17 of Article 1, Section 8, over the District of Columbia and other federal enclaves. It's why in the last Congress I introduced something called the Allow Act, which would use Congress's federal jurisdiction over D.C. and federal enclaves to bring about needed occupational reforms. What other federal changes, if any, would you suggest in helping us to try to address the burden of excessive occupational licensing? Any other ideas on that as far as what Congress could do, or are they all at the state level?
Thank you for this question. I'm actually really reluctant of using the federal government to micromanage state and local affairs, and this is as costly as it is a problem. I think this may be a case, again, apart from information, putting out reports, which is not without value. I don't know that the federal government, unfortunately, has a lot of things to do. That said, there's been very successful challenges for occupational licensing, barriers before the Supreme Court. Hopefully there will be more of them. There is some good news because it does look like some states are actually really seriously looking into the issue. Arizona, passed the first step into actually opening the door to the transferability of licenses. It's not perfect because my understanding is that you can come and work in Arizona, but then at some point you have to get the Arizona license. I'm unsure about this, but I think there's some of this. It could be that the federal government could put out information about best practices in that regard. But again, I unfortunately I come here and tell you these are like really big problems, but I don't know that you can really do very much about it.
Right. I assume you wouldn't disagree with me on our Enclave Clause authority, though. We've got authority over.
If you have authority
over D.C. and federal property, military.
But in D.C., child care, for instance, we've been talking about the cost of child care, and the cost of child care is absolutely increased quite dramatically in D.C. because of the lack of supply of healthcare brought on by occupational licensing requirements that are quite stringent and that keep out low-income, low-education people.
Is Arizona the state you'd identify as at the cutting edge of this?
To my knowledge, this is like the states that have actually taken the broader steps. And again, it's only a first step. There's way more to do. For instance, they need to reform their own licensing system within the state, which is still too burdensome and keeping because the problem is the progression of occupational licensing since the 50s has been quite dramatic, and as a result, it's included a lot of low-income workers and low-paid jobs, and that's problematic for income mobility. It's problematic at many levels. And there's a new study that just came out that actually looked at the welfare effect of occupational licensing, and that showed that while they increase the wages and the hours of the people within the industry who already have the license, it actually keeps employment down for those who don't.
So it's classic protectionist activity.
It is absolutely protectionism.
It's a government-sponsored welfare system. In other words, it's using the overwhelming force of the state in order to protect the wealthy and the well-connected at the expense of the poor and middle class.
And they may be a case, right, for a higher risk professions like medical practice, even though there's like question about whether actually occupational licensing requirement do increase the quality of the work. But I just hard to imagine that the state or the local government have, to protect us against non-matching pillows or something like this.
Right, right. I mean, that could be bad.
Well,
If somebody recommends matching, say, an unlicensed, unscrupulous interior direct decorator gives you clashing pillows.
Yeah, well, I don't think they would actually come up like a very strong number on the national data, but
That's a fair point. I had a constituent a few years ago make the following observation. I want to see if you agree with this. The observation was, in those professions where you can identify in the abstract the greatest need for occupational licensing, where there's the greatest potential health and public safety threat as a result of someone practicing outside of something they know how to do, in those same areas, the occupational license seems to be the least significant factor. The examples that were given to me by this constituent included the fact that apparently if you get a pilot's license, once you are a pilot, in theory, you could fly a 747. Whether or not you can fly a particular 747 is going to be up to the owner of that 747. So too with a medical degree. In theory, you're licensed to practice medicine, which might include delivering a baby, doing heart surgery or brain surgery, or removing a wart. But whether or not you know how to do any of those things may not be determined as much by your state-issued occupational license as by your particular credentialing and training that you've received from private organizations rather than a state. Would you agree with that?
I agree.
Mr. Cass, let's talk about marriage for a minute, marriage and family formation. It seems to me there might be kind of a chicken and egg problem, and I want you to help me unravel this. Like you, I'm concerned that if more men can't find stable, steady work, the result is likely to be fewer marriages. In the first instance, more divorces in the second instance. But isn't it also likely that to the extent that marriage is collapsing, that marriage rates are falling, men in general will tend to feel less pressure, less of a need to be breadwinners or to be involved in the lives of their children, and that in turn could translate into more unemployment, less stable family lives, and other societal and economic problems. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's certainly true.
One of the things I'm always looking to do in this committee, because it's my belief that institutions of civil society and free markets can't be created by government. And certainly families are no exception to the principle that a government can't create an institution of civil society. Governments can, however, weaken those institutions, and once it weakens them, where it has weakened them, government's not necessarily very good at turning the switch back on. Are there areas you would point to that you think represent the sort of lowest hanging fruit of where we could identify that the federal government is impeding marriage or family formation?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think the way you've put the problem is exactly right, that in a sense we have a vicious cycle where declining economic opportunities and outcomes harm family formation, and in turn the culture that is devaluing and de-emphasizing family formation potentially in turn harms economic engagement. I think for policymakers, the question when you encounter a cycle the challenge when you encounter a cycle like that is to not just throw up your hands and say, well, that looks like a big mess. And instead, the question is to say, well, where in that cycle is there potentially an opportunity to intervene? It seems to me there's very little potential to intervene directly on the cultural side through simply reasserting through public policy the importance of family formation, though with respect to the bully pulpit, it certainly helps to talk about it. But conversely, the labor market side offers, I think, a very salient opportunity to intervene. I think to the extent that things have gotten worse, to the extent that we could imagine a world in which things got better, that is a world in which you wouldn't immediately turn the cycle on its head and solve all the problems, but you would expect to slow the cycle and you would expect to have better outcomes than we do today. And so I think that's why, rather than getting hung up on exactly how much of the problem we can attribute to what and how much of the causation runs in each direction, we should be asking, where can policy help? Where do we think it would be likely to support stronger families? And I think a stronger labor market is that place.
Mr. Schweikert.